Sorry about that. Welcome. State Engineer's Office is up next. The floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the committee. I'm Brandon Gebhardt, the state engineer, and with me I've got Jeff Cowley, who is the head of our Interstate Streams Division, and Kristen Baker, who is the head of our Fiscal Division. So, Mr. Chairman, I will give a brief update on the state of the agency, some of our challenges and risks that I see, and then we'll get into our loan exception or supplemental budget requests. So the state engineer, we operate under a biennial budget of roughly $27 million and 116 positions. And that funding is split up approximately half from the general fund and half from Water One, which funds our Board of Control division under the state engineer's office. We operate under essentially 8 divisions. We've got the groundwater, surface water. We've got a Board of Control division, our interstate stream division. We have an administrative division, which our fiscal office falls under as well, and then our support services division. And then we also are the home for the Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors and the Board of Water Well Drilling Contractors and Water Well Pump Installation Contractors. Some of our largest challenges and risks right now, drought. Drought is one of the biggest issues we're facing right now, and how that impacts our interstate compacts and our interstate decrees, and we're dealing with potential calls from downstream states on our water. And I think everybody is aware of the very rapidly declining conditions in the Colorado River, which is another one of the biggest things that we're dealing with in our agency. I anticipate questions about resources and staffing and vacancies. Retention and turnover have impacted our agency. I think last year we had about an 18% turnover, 21 folks turned over in our agency in just this last year. And so that does create problems. Institutional knowledge is lost every time that occurs. If there are questions, I can get into that more. Mr. Chairman, I would offer to answer any questions on the state of the agency before I jump into the supplemental request.
Any questions? You got us after lunch. They're not moving too fast. Let's get them juiced up. Go ahead.
All right, Mr. Chairman. On page 9 of our supplemental budget narrative, we have one priority. And what we are asking for, I mentioned institutional knowledge before. This is all tied to that institutional knowledge. So what we requested is a $40,000 appropriation this year, and then $40,000 for each biennium following. And what this would do, it would increase our 900 series budget. We currently have a contract with Hinckley Consulting. Hinckley Consulting provided expert witness testimony in both the Nebraska v. Wyoming and the Montana v. Wyoming lawsuits. And we still utilize him. We've had an ongoing contract with him. That money's about to run out. I think we have 22,000 left in that. And we would really like to keep him involved because we're doing some things in those to satisfy those compact decrees that are a change to what was established as the decree was written. One of the things that we're dealing with, particularly on the North Platte, the consumptive use calculations, we're specified a certain depletion amount that we can have in the basin, the North Platte Basin. And that is all based on consumptive use calculations. And as part of the decree, an exhibit was provided as to how do you calculate what that consumptive use is. And over time, some of the resources and the data that goes into those calculations is no longer available. People aren't maintaining it. They're not providing it. Federal agencies aren't doing it. Yield analysis that was once done by, I think the FSA, that data is not available anymore. So we're trying to stay within the intent of the decree, but look at what we can do to calculate the consumptive use. And then that has to be bought off by the neighboring states. And so that's one of the things that we're doing. We're doing some work up in the Yellowstone River Compact. That's part of the Montana v. Wyoming lawsuit. And one of the sticky situations with that is Montana can make a call based on substantial evidence. And that's the wording in the decree. And that substantial evidence is vague. And so the Montana made a call last year for post-1950 water rights in Wyoming. And the call was in place until Tongue River Reservoir was reasonably believed to be filling. And so they made a call and it lasted April 1st through May 9th. And one of the concerns we have is agreeing with the substantial evidence that the reservoir will or will not fill. And so we intend to hopefully use Hinkley Consulting, who developed a model during the lawsuit. He helped develop a model as to how to predict whether Tongue River would fill or not. And so we need to do some more work with that model. And every time we do this, it needs to be justifiable to the other state as well. And with that institutional knowledge, Byrne understands the intent of the decree, all the conversations that went into that, and that's really beneficial as we start developing these new ideas so that we and the other states can agree on this is the method we all agree to. We're going to use this to answer these questions. And so that, Mr. Chairman, is the main reason for this request in front of you right now.
So is that paid on an hourly rate for time? What's the nature of the contract?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it would be on an as needs basis, and it is a hourly type of a contract. So hours worked, hours billed, and we reimburse on invoice.
Okay. Any further questions? Representative Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Byrne Hinkley went to work or became a consultant 20 some years ago in the original North Platte decree and is probably getting a little bit older. So who is his backup, or what kind of other folks are out there, and to start training and passing some of this knowledge along in terms of consultants? I'm not against using the individual. I just hate to get down the road 2 or 3 years from now and he decides to retire and leaves us searching. Is it good to start training someone else new at this time?
So
First question. Second question is really a follow-up to the chairman's question. As needed basis on an hourly rate up to a maximum number of hours, or can we work him to 40 hours a week, 352 weeks a year, 365 days a year, all for that 40,000?
So, Mr. Chairman, I'll try the first question. It is our hope and our plan that as we go through these processes, that our staff are learning too. And eventually, this type of service may not be needed for these particular things. We're always aware of these compacts and decrees are very complex and there's lots of different things in them. We don't know what the next thing is. So having him on retainer will help if those things come up. I'm not saying that we're going to use all of this money all the time. It's there if we need it and to answer the questions as they come. But the intent is that folks within the SEO become the experts. We've had, the decree was in 2001, so we've had a lot of turnover there. And so understanding, just bridging that until we get up to speed on what the reasoning was behind it. But yes, Mr. Walters, the intent was to bridge the gap for now, use it on as needs and educate our own folks on it. So actually the succession plan is for SEO, not necessarily an individual, but it is nice to have a little pool of money that if something comes up that we can react quickly and get the expertise that we need, whether it's Burn or whether it's somebody else.
Any further questions? Okay. I think that's it.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I've got one question, as much as a question as is a little bit of an update. I know we've got a governor's letter that was alluded to the other day for an additional $500,000 for a study for the Colorado River. By the way, the Colorado River Compact is 100 years old this week. So it's been around for a long time, and just a little
There's
background.
more water back then.
It was the first water compact among states in the history of the United States. It is compacts that has to be approved by the Supreme Court. So just a little background, it really set the bar for what we now is all the other water compacts. Belle Fourche, Bighorn, Bear River, Snake River, all these compacts were all predicated on the Colorado. But as I think the state engineer indicated, things are not going well on the Colorado. In fact, as of last Monday, we had through the governor's working group, an update from the Upper Colorado River Commission, which is the UCRC, which the state of Wyoming participates in. But the hydrology in the basin is looking worse than it has even in recent projections. And one of the latest things that's coming about is even if we have water above the power pool in Powell, which is a critical elevation, they've been trying to manage for that. Now the concerns is you have to keep it even above what that intake is because of cavitation of those. Once you get to a certain level, even though you're not down to zero, users that are familiar have a little bit understand what cavitation does. And so that's one of the latest things that's come out and say we could potentially hit the point where there's zero power production depending on what this snowpack is. It could be August or September of this year. By next year, likely, bar a couple of big snowpack winters in the Colorado. So things are changing very, very rapidly. Based on that discussion through the governor's work group, one of the potential recommendations is to add another FTE to the state engineer's office to work on the Colorado and some supplemental modeling, consulting, data expertise. But what I do is I would ask the state engineers just to give us a real quick rundown of that and where we're at in the discussions that have taken place. And so before we do that, I want to predicate this with one thing. This is, we should always learn from our history. And we just got an update with Vern Hinckley on the North Platte River. So I can show you is that was a lawsuit between Wyoming and Nebraska. Colorado intervened. We spent millions litigating over that. We now, as a result of that litigation, have 7 full-time employees in the Board of Control that do nothing to monitor with the compliance associated with that lawsuit. The losers in that lawsuit was the state of Nebraska, the state of Wyoming, and the state of Colorado. The winner was the endangered species in the North Platte and the federal government. So there's a cautionary note there that going forward, if we don't get a good handle on what all of our available options are and be our own best experts, we're headed to litigation on the Colorado. I would much rather make an investment in a couple of FTEs now than a protracted litigation plus a giant staff for compact compliance issues associated. So with that, I would just turn it over, but a little background as to what's going on, why there's more. From the time the governor wrote the letter 2 or 3 weeks ago to the latest update from the UCRC on the hydrology and some of these other issues, I think that's why you're going to see a little bit of disparity in some of the discussion as to what's actually needed by the state engineer's office. But I would turn that, Mr. Chairman, over to the state engineer if he wanted to add anything or elaborate on that.
Mr. Chairman, real quick. Mr. Chairman, question for Senator Hicks. Were you a signer on the original Colorado River Compact?
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman,
Chairman, at risk of asking a question like that, I might indulge you, but I won't at this point in time. But it is very interesting. The guy that was the state engineer at the time went on to be the governor of the state of Wyoming, and his picture's downstairs. And he was the prime negotiator. A man named Governor Emerson was one of the guys that actually negotiated the Colorado River Compact on behalf of the state engineers or the state of Wyoming.
First state engineer. You asked for.
That's the short.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And just a couple things. So originally we, as Mr. Senator Hicks alluded to, we worked with the governor's office and suggested that we could use some modeling in the Colorado River Basin. And so we informed him that we think that $500,000 would be appropriate to start setting up a model. This model could be used for both refuting and approving, or not approving, refuting and agreeing to other states' models. Each of the other states have complex hydrologic models. Wyoming does not at this time. We think that it would be helpful to have that both in our interstate discussions as well as eventually into the administration of water rights in our annual administration, and potentially if we get to the point of a curtailment, the administration of water in that. So that was one request that we discussed with the governor's office. And then the second one is still in discussion with the governor's office. We made him aware of the conversation we had in the working group. And that was the potential to add one FTE and then increase our 900 series budget to contract to start answering some of the questions that we know we're going to have, not only in our discussions with the other states, but also as how it impacts our water users and how we can try to protect the water use in our state. Things such as consumptive use, conveyance losses in streams, many of the things that will play into potential programs that are on the horizon, as well as the administration of water when it's needed. So we are still in the, we had initial discussions with the governor's office, and we're still in those conversations with him on that.
Okay,
That's it.
appreciate it. Any further questions? Well, thank you for being here. Thanks for being here a little bit early. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you,
bet.
members.
So next, we will have the Department of Health. By the way, the bill that we worked on this morning, that draft is, revisions have already been made, and since we might be done a little bit early, I thought we'd finish that bill this evening since it's fresh in our mind.
Yeah, I said it was.
Come on up. Welcome, Stefan. Good to see you. Far away.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, my name is Stefan Johansson. I'm the Director for the Wyoming Department of Health. It's good to be with you this afternoon.
Hold that mic a little.
How's that, Mr. Chairman?
Better.
I'll get real friendly with it. Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me just for 5 or 6 minutes, I'd like to introduce you to the staff that I have with me today for our budget hearing. Starting with Eric McVicker to my right, our Chief Financial Officer. Virtually, we're joined by Stephanie Pyle, who is the Senior Administrator for the Public Health Division. Jan Stahl is behind me, our Interim State Medicaid Agent. Matt Petrie is the Senior Administrator for the Behavioral Health Division. David Robinson, Policy Administrator in the Director's Office. Franz Fuchs, our Chief Data Analyst. We're joined, I believe, virtually by Kim Detai, our Public Information Officer. And we also have a few folks from the Healthcare Financing Division, Jesse Springer, Matt Hager, Corey Cooper, and Lee Grossman, should you have detailed questions about their specific areas that I am inept or incapable of answering. And last but certainly not least, Jeff Clark with our Aging Division. Mr. Chairman, if I may, there's a few items I'd like to highlight for the committee before we dive right into the budget request, which I'm grateful this year is relatively short. But some of these items that I'll mention do have overlap either with our budget this year or with legislation that is pending. I do want to mention we have finished and completed construction at the Wyoming State Hospital a couple of years ago, and just this year at the Wyoming Life Resource Center. Notable and very large accomplishments for the state of Wyoming. Several of you on this committee were pivotal in those projects, and the department couldn't be more grateful for your support. Now, if we can staff those facilities, I think the state will really see a material benefit in how we care for those with behavioral health needs. We are nearing completion, had a few delays, but we're nearing completion on the Veterans Skilled Nursing Facility in Buffalo, wrapping up some punch list items and final touches on one of the hardened cottages for a more acute population. And this body, this past year in session, has continued our behavioral health redesign. You might remember several years ago, members of the committee, we sat in this room, I believe Senator Bebout was chairing at the time, asking what are we going to do with our community mental health system? How do we make that sustainable and get the best outcomes that we can with the dollars that we're investing? And I'm really pleased to report that we are in year 2 of implementing the legislatively authorized behavioral health redesign. And in conjunction with our providers, I couldn't be more pleased with where we're going. And we are required by statute to implement that redesign by July 1st of 2024. We've had a lot of examples of successes so far with that redesign, and we're on track for implementation. In addition, Mr. Chairman, this legislature appropriated about $60 million of ARPA funds to the Department of Health through this past year's Senate File 66. We have a variety of programs that we've stood up with that or completed, including Health and Human Service and EMS staffing stabilization at $18 million. That program is wrapping up. Provider relief, capital improvements, and innovation grants. We are in the process of making those award notifications 2 weeks ago and going into next week. And various other programs, including mental health support for first responders, expansion of the 211 system, and a variety of other areas. We, as a department directly from the federal government, received over $220 million of CARES and ARPA funds for a variety of areas, mostly in public health, around immunizations, epidemiology, laboratory capacity, and mental health support. Wanted to mention to the committee, proud of the staff in my agency that have stood all of that up. We are only leveraging one-time AWAC positions when necessary to put that support in place, knowing that it's temporary and knowing that those dollars are eventually going away. I also should mention, Mr. Chairman, we have reached completion of our WINGS system. Some of you might remember that was our massive Medicaid management information system reprocurement. You all invested in that years ago and gave us direction to redesign and implement that system. And the team at Medicaid and Healthcare Financing have really innovated. We're one of the only states that have reprocured in a model like this that is modular, funded mostly 90% by federal funds, and has really big potential for leveraging that technology in other areas of the department and potential other areas of the state. And finally, Mr. Chairman, our facility and field operations, it has obviously been a tough time the past 2 or 3 years, and that has continued in the past calendar year. we struggle in our facilities and our field offices to staff. It's one of my biggest challenges as your health director is to staff our safety net facilities. But at the state hospital, the Life Resource Center, the Retirement Center, Veterans Home, Pioneer Home, and our public health offices around the state, the staff are really doing an admirable job with the resources and the staff that they have to keep our census up, to keep services to your counties, your courts, and your communities, and wanted to give them the recognition that they deserve. Mr. Chairman, diving right into the budget, as a quick summary, in this supplemental budget, the department is requesting or did request $33.9 million in general funds and $83.8 million in federal funds. As you can see in your budget document, the governor has recommended $18.6 million in state general funds, $83.8 million in federal funds, and $5.5 million in other funds for a total request of just over $108 million. That's a big number, Mr. Chairman. And in case there's a little bit of sticker shock, and it might feel like an easier pill to swallow, just remember that that $108 million translates only to a measly 6,209 Bitcoin. And that's as of last week, so plus or minus $50 million or so, but wouldn't recommend appropriating our budget in cryptocurrency. Mr. Chairman, the materials that we shared with the committee are really just for your reference today. You have a policy brief giving an overview of dental rates in Wyoming Medicaid, which will support our first priority request for dental reimbursement, mostly for children. You also have a policy brief on nursing home reimbursement and nursing home cost coverage, also in Wyoming Medicaid, which would be in support or context for our number 2 priority exception request. In addition, as usual, going back 5 or 6 years, we haven't given it to you yet. I think it will be more efficient if we go right into the budget. We do have an at-a-glance budget roadmap for this supplemental budget, should you want it or need it as this budget progresses through the process into January and ultimately into the legislative session. Provides a bit more detail, a little bit of context of what happened with our budget legislatively this past year, but certainly can provide that to the committee on your request. But today we intend to work off of the supplemental book, as our exception request table takes up just a little less than a page and a half. So with that, I would ask Mr. Chairman if the committee would turn to page 10 of the supplemental budget. And really, Mr. Chairman, your preference, I'm happy to walk through that table, reference the page numbers where the additional detail in the request can be found. Or Mr. Chairman, if you'd like a page turn through the supplemental budget, we can certainly do that as well.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
I'd like it if they went through each supplemental in page order.
Okay,
That's what we've done with everybody else.
Yeah.
Happy to do that.
okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just mention on page 10 and 11, you can see the exception request by priority in that table, starting with our dental rates, leading into our nursing home rates and on and on. But we can go ahead and dive straight into our first exception request, which is on page number 13. We could probably discuss this one very quickly. It is a position that I requested in the director's office as a strategic business analyst. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I just mentioned our completion of the WINGS enterprise system in Medicaid. From discussions that we've had over the years, we know that there's opportunity to leverage that across the department. And we have a lot of data systems across the department, as you well know. The idea behind this request was to have a business analyst in my office that could help us put that more on the front burner in the years to come, identifying small, medium, and large systems across the department that could benefit from the technology of that Medicaid system in claims processing, case management, a variety of provider enrollment, variety of different areas. You'll note here the governor has denied the position, and I'll be frank with the committee. I think we can wait and discuss this position potentially in the next budget for the 25-26 budget.
Sam Larson.
So I want to make sure that I understand this, if I could, Director Johansson, a little bit, as I've asked you questions and I've had to digest, but this is more of how we can use that wing system. And this committee has said, as we as we design these systems, how can we make them interactive across state agencies? And I've been chewing on this, and I think what we're saying with this wing system is how can we utilize it more within the programs that we have within the Department of Health, and not will this align with YDOT, but how can we perhaps, but how do we do this? And so I was thinking of the community mental health redesign and the community mental health providers in establishing those Medicaid rates and things that they're looking at could then fit some of these programs that are kind of a little bit outside or out in the community. Then how do we make them more efficient through the investment that we put in this system? Am I getting that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes, I'll give you a few easy examples. So as I mentioned, in our 4 operating divisions, we have a lot of data systems, and they all have their own complexities. They all have their own nuance. But from my perspective, they all do a lot of the same thing. They pay bills, they track outcomes or services, they enroll providers, and it ranges from very small systems, $10,000, $20,000 a year, to very large systems, $1 million a year across the department. Given that those functions are very similar, we know we have an inventory of those systems and what they do, and systems need to be reprocured every 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the contract and the RFP. What gets backburnered in my office, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman and Representative Larson, is the strategic plan on how, over the next 5 years, how do we plan to leverage that wing system in those functionalities? So aging division, senior center, we have systems there. You mentioned community mental health and substance abuse. We will in the next year be moving forward as part of the redesign, doing some of that work anyways, with looking how we can leverage the Medicaid system for our community mental health centers and make it more efficient and less costly, not only for us, but for the providers. Again, I think members of the committee, I want you to hear me say this is certainly not an impact that will cause the department to shut down or inability to use data systems, but would certainly recommend keeping it on the radar for the next budget.
Thank you.
Chairman,
Go ahead.
when you come back next time, if you could bring a business case for this, it'd be appreciated. Of course, what caught my eye is the last 2 words of section C, cost savings. And I don't know if you can spitball some estimates as to what those would be and where they might be. You probably have some high priority targets where you think that there's some big gains. And if you can show that the position is going to more than pay for itself, that's a conversation worth having. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Members of the committee, moving on, our next request is on page number 19. And this is priority number 4, Medicare buy-in enrollment increase. Most of you on this committee will recall that we have a program in Wyoming Medicaid that for individuals who qualify for both Medicare and Medicaid, but may not be enrolled in Medicare, we will buy them into Medicare. The reason for that is if they're on Medicaid, the state foots more of the cost of their care. So it's advantageous for the state to essentially pay their premiums and their cost sharing on Medicare so that we offload those costs out of the Medicaid program. Because of enrollment increases due to our aging population in Wyoming, and because of increased costs in Medicare over the years, many of you, we've discussed that before at this committee, we essentially get a bill from the federal government on those costs. So it's a frustrating request that often every year or a couple of years we will bring to this committee. But I'll point out, you can see in the detail on this exception request with the amount of federal funds we leverage, it is in our interest to use Medicare in this situation rather than paying these entire costs in the Medicaid program. Again, it's $1.5 million of general funds, $8 million of federal funds. You can see, I won't call it a return. Again, it's frustrating because these costs keep coming, but we anticipate this would cover us for a good number of years into the future.
So what, Stefan, how much do we pay per individual? I think it's all age-based to some degree. And then there are multiple programs in Medicare. So which one do we purchase?
Mr. Chairman, I might look to my healthcare financing staff or Mr. Fuchs to help answer that. I do think the amount per person would vary. On the state side, however, with what we're buying, it really is just that cost sharing. So the premiums and the Medicare cost sharing is what we would pay. In terms of the overall cost, we can provide that breakdown to the committee, but it looks like I have a lifeline here with Mr. Fuchs who could answer that.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd presume if they're Medicaid eligible, that they're going to come in at the lowest possible premium rate, I would think.
Well, but there's different types of premiums as well. So
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Franz Fuchs, Chief Policy Analyst, Department of Health. To answer your question, Chairman Nicholas, so Medicaid pays both the Part A premiums for a handful of individuals, and those tend to be a little bit higher, so around $400 to $500. But that's a handful. That's maybe 100, 200 people a year that we pay those premiums for. The vast majority of this expenditure goes to Part B premiums, which are currently $164.50. And we have approximately 12,000 dual enrollees. So if you multiply out that by 24 months, you get the approximate biennial cost for this.
So that was my next question. Right now we have 12,000 enrollees, more or less. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. Around 12,000 dual
you're-
Medicare, Medicaid.
You're
enrollees.
expecting a 5% increase in that number. So another 600 people coming on.
Mr. Chairman, the enrollment will increase just due to demographics with the bulge of the baby boom coming. But there also has been an increase in Part B premiums. So last year in 2021, the premium was $148.50. So since 2011, premiums have gone up approximately 40%. Enrollment's gone up about 30%. So it's driven by both, but largely in this case, driven by the premium increase.
Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
why do you have to buy Part A? Why do you have to buy some folks into Part A?
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Kinski, the handful of people that in the state may not have worked the necessary quarters, the 40 quarters, in order to qualify for premium-free Part
Okay.
A coverage.
Thank you. And then turning to page 19, I want to understand what the 1.5 million and the 8 million is for. I mean, conceptually, I get it. So somebody's 64 and they're on Medicaid and it's costing us $100,000 a year for their care. They turn 65, we pay their Medicare premiums. And a lot of that, almost all that expense gets shifted over, but to Medicare. So we're paying the premium. What's the 8 million for? The 1.5 million, I presume, is the premium? Or is that something different? What am I not following here? I assume you're just paying the premium to buy them in, but that's not what these numbers seem to say to me.
Mr. Chairman,
Walk me
if
through the mechanics of this.
we may, we'll add another cook to this kitchen. Introduce you to Jesse Springer with the Medicaid program.
Jesse Springer with the Wyoming Medicaid program. So there's 3 match rates for the premiums. Some of the premiums we pay at 100% federal funds. So we're just paying the federal government back its own money, but it allows us to do that. Some of the premiums are at 50% federal funds
Okay.
as just normal Medicaid expenditures, and some of them are at 100% general funds. So it just varies. There's different groups, and that's how it gets to this math. This is also historical balancing. So the real request for general funds here is 1.5, but we've been short on federal funds in this unit. So this is actually just tying this unit up for federal funds. So the growth there is 1.5. If we hadn't been supplementing this unit with other federal funds from other units, the federal fund request would be 1.5 as well. But basically, we've been overspending the federal funds here and borrowing it from other Medicaid units, which is allowed by statute. But that's why there's a difference here between those numbers. And this is trying to get this back in balance.
So the 8 million is simple, Mr. Chairman, the 8 million is simple. It's a simple pass through transfer back and forth of the federal funds.
Yes, some of it is a transfer pass through back and forth. I mean, basically they're giving us federal funds and we're repaying it to the federal government. So,
Okay.
I mean, that is a very odd situation, but I mean, these are matchable Medicaid expenditures, so we're allowed to do that.
It's like playing Monopoly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, it's like playing Monopoly with money that you print before the game. Moving on, members of the committee, our next exception request is on page number 22. It's priority number 8. This is essentially the continuation of the enhanced federal match in Medicaid that we have been receiving since the federal public health emergency for COVID began. You may recall that was implemented kind of midway through calendar year 2020, but retroactive to January of 2020. And since that time, the Wyoming Medicaid program and Medicaid programs across the country have seen a 6.2% federal match, or what we call FMAP, increase. So generally in Wyoming Medicaid, our match rate is 50-50. As you know, 50% federal, 50% general fund. So we have seen a match rate for the past 2.5 years or so of 56.2% federal funds. As some of you recall from our previous budget discussions, this got very complicated, but what that is intended for since the public emergency began is the federal government during the emergency has not allowed Medicaid programs to disenroll any Medicaid clients, meaning we have folks on Wyoming Medicaid that historically and traditionally would not be eligible, whether it's because of income categorization or what we call categorical eligibility on certain types of conditions. We have not disenrolled members for the past 2.5 years from Wyoming Medicaid. You'll see that in our enrollment data. We've discussed this numerous times with this committee over the past couple of years. That enhanced match was really at its outset intended to cover potential increased utilization in Medicaid because of that prohibition on disenrollment. In Wyoming, we've seen some of that increased utilization, but not really across the board. And so essentially, as you've seen for a couple of sessions working the Department of Health budget, we have had general fund offsets by nature of having enhanced federal match without that utilization that potentially some other states have seen. In addition, members of the committee, not to add complexity to this, when the public health emergency does end, and I've been saying that for 2 years, so it's been frustrating because we know it's coming, but they just extended it again. But when that emergency ends, suddenly that enhanced match will go away. And instead of allowing states to disenroll all of those Medicaid members immediately on that next day, there will be requirements to ratchet that disenrollment down over the course of a year. So we will potentially see some cost exposure there. And again, that's what that enhanced match and some of those general fund offsets have been for. But as you know, we also worked with this committee and the legislature in our current budget to fund a variety of exception requests for the 23-24 budget using those, what we call reversion carry forward, that general fund offset that we've accumulated. This exception request, as you'll see, $18 million of federal funds is another continuation of that, basically 2 additional quarters of that enhanced match that not only gives us federal spending authority, but depending on that utilization and that disenrollment dynamic going forward, potentially additional general fund offsets in this biennium and maybe leading into the 25-26 biennium. So, Mr. Chairman, that is an incredibly long-winded explanation of this request, which is really federal spending authority for that enhanced 6.2% match. But happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to see you, Director Franz. Might be the last time I see you guys. It's my understanding that there have been conversations about the inequities of our FMAP and maybe improving upon them. And I would love an update and know if there's any cause for optimism.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, you're right. Wyoming is one of what we call the floor states on federal match in Medicaid. We're a 50-50 state.
There's only 4 of them?
A floor state, excuse me.
Floor.
I don't know how many states are at the floor, but is it 6? We could certainly provide that breakdown. That formula for federal Medicaid match is in federal statute. So, negotiating a different match with the federal government is difficult. Certainly a discussion that we've continued to have of how that calculation could be reconsidered by Congress. But, the states, that have different per capita economics and different population dynamics that are at 60, 65, 70% match. If that were to change in Wyoming's favor, you'd probably see many states complaining that their match would go the other direction. Representative Schwartz, I will mention that I think our Medicaid program and healthcare financing division does a great job on those alternative match rates that we have on various things, especially when it comes to technology, where we can get 90% match, 75% match for operations and maintenance. We've taken, I think the state has taken a lot of advantage of this enhanced match during the public health emergency, not to spend frivolously in the Medicaid program, but to work with you all to essentially bank funds and be able to fund obligations temporarily on a one-time basis in the course of this biennium and potentially into the next. But simple answer to the question, Representative Schwartz, I don't see a whole lot of potential or momentum outside of an act of Congress for Wyoming's match rate to change unless the fundamental economics of the state were to change.
And I almost hesitate to ask this, but hypothetically, if Teton County became a principality and was not included in the calculation, what would the FMAP become? Do we know?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, at risk of offending our friends and family in Teton County, it would go up. If Teton County were not part of the FMAP calculation in Wyoming, our match rate would increase. We have some estimates. I think it's best to call it a swag of what that would look like. But it certainly is an outlier county for Wyoming and does inflate that general fund exposure.
Mr. Chairman, you can't leave us hanging. What's the swag?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, let me see if we have that. If memory, we can get it to you. If I recall from the analysis we did, we would be into the 60% match area. So significant, 10 to 15%.
I say Representative Schwartz for president of the newly succeeded People's Republic of Teton County.
Mr. Chairman, president is, I don't think, really the title I was hoping for. I was thinking something more like Representative Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, suppose there were only 3 states rather than 4 states. Could the FMAP be improved? Is there any possibility in going in for that waiver that the FMAP could be improved?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, again, the formula is set in federal statute. So it's based fundamentally on the per capita economics of each state. So regardless of the number of states, I don't think that would change. I do want to clarify, though, that we have seen historically changes to Wyoming's FMAP, not often, but during the Great Recession and the subsequent years, I believe we did see a bump because, again, the fundamental economics of this state and every other state did change. But outside of that formula, there really isn't a whole lot of wiggle room.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, the next.
Don?
Mr. Chairman, just while the agency is here, on the bottom of page 22, the last sentence under paragraph C, justification, I think that is a request for a change to section 309 when you do a budget markup, and I just wanted to bring that to the committee's attention.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Richards, thank you. In this request for potential use of those enhanced match dollars, Don is absolutely right. As you recall, the last budget did give us authority for a variety of things that you all authorized that were exception requests, where we did not fund them with general fund, we funded them with these reversions. In addition, there was general authority in the budget bill for use of those reversions in unanticipated Medicaid expenditures, which I just mentioned, the disenrollment issue, Title 25, Department of Health facilities. To bring to the committee's attention, we do have some needs here in Cheyenne at our Wyoming Public Health Laboratory. As you know, that staff and that function has been inordinately expanded and stressed over the past couple of years. There are a variety of system and equipment needs, in addition to capital needs that kind of overlap with capital construction and major maintenance. I think with authority to use any, and, anticipated reversions, if they're there, they may not be, but if they are, to have the public health laboratory here, potentially the flexibility for me to authorize spending of those reversions for some of those significant needs would be beneficial.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
and you'll recall, Mr. Johansson, we were not a big fan of allowing those reversions to be used. The better bookkeeping would have been to bring them back in and then spend appropriately, but we did it. I guess, are you anticipating that we're going to continue that practice going forward? Because I'm not sure that we've become any more a fan than we were before.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, it's a good question, and I think it's a trade-off. So last budget, to set the 23-24 budget, we had significant exception requests because of cuts that we had proposed in step 3 the previous year, which were significant, and presenting to this committee, and ultimately the legislature said, do not make those cuts. We will give you 1 year or 1 biennium worth of funding to delay those cuts. The funding source for a lot of those appropriations were these reversions. So you're absolutely right. It does create decision-making down the road for most of those items in next year's budget session for the 25-26 budget. But we, again, in the breakdown that I mentioned that we're happy to share with the committee, we've referenced what all of those exception requests and cut restorations were that relied on these reversion funding.
Go ahead.
So Stephen, I think it sticks in my head that we allowed for 80 million and to be in reversions to be used for other, what would have historically been general fund appropriations. So the reduction of the step 3 cuts in putting back in the community mental health stuff that we put back in, we use that. But did the reversions, are you anticipating the reversions exceeding the 80 million? And if so, by how much?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, another good question. So we, to put it in rough terms, we came in the 21-22 budget at about $93 million of general fund reversions. The legislature gave us authority to carry forward 80 million of those reversions to fund some of the items that you just mentioned, among some others. That is approximately just north of $40 million of exception requests from this past year, last January, and about $20 million of facility staffing needs. That $20 million we have sat on, we have not expended it because we know turning on the new Life Resource Center, the Veterans Home, et cetera, those are savings that the department accumulated that would be beneficial to have. So it comes in roughly at around $60 million of quote unquote obligations through exception request or the budget. And then the delta of that, so 80 million minus that 60, is about $20 million of reversions that are in our pot right now for those unanticipated expenditures, like the Medicaid disenrollment issue, needs at the facilities, things that Title 25 costs, which we do believe we will exceed our budget in this biennium. Can certainly discuss that. That's really where those reversions are currently obligated.
Well, my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I get that up to the 80 million. But are you expecting to see reversions in excess of 80 million? And then how much past that would you anticipate seeing being reverted back?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, thank you for the clarification. Yes, in this biennium, subject to change, I want to be careful here. We do anticipate that we will exceed the amount of reversions that we have collected because of this enhanced match that continues during the public health emergency.
But you don't have a feel for what that might be.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, every quarter that the public health emergency extends, barring any changes in utilization, like I mentioned, we are estimating about $9 million of offsets per quarter. So this request of $18 million essentially represents our best estimate through the end of this calendar year of what those offsets would be. You'll see throughout the budget and working with Director Hibbert and his staff and the governor's office, that there are exception requests in here looking at not using the full general fund amount, but taking advantage of those offsets on a one-time basis. But we do anticipate that our collected reversions this biennium will exceed the authority that we've been given.
So, thank you. So then when you go into long-term care and we take half of our general fund commitment, that $5.5 million out of reversions, it's those reversions that are anticipated in excess of the 80 million already committed.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's correct.
Thank you.
So, Stefan, I'm curious of whether or not the state is doing enough to pursue statutory change or some type of exception under the rules to address the FMAP issue. And so I'm just thinking out loud, why wouldn't the legislature, or would they have at least an educational value, but also an incentive for our congressional delegation and the executive branch? If we do a joint resolution, for example, and or pass legislation that says in the event of, in order to get to 60% or whatever that is, or to maintain 56% when the emergency goes away, and outline, in that joint resolution, the terms of, or the rationalization for it. I mean, if you take the cost of medicine in Wyoming compared to other states, to me, that ought to be a criteria to some extent. If you take the fact that we have a growing elderly population and a percentage of more elderly people, which impact us more severely on those costs of medicine, and all of those little components that lead up to the economic impacts on us as a state as compared to other states. Just to help educate both the legislature, the executive branch, and to encourage our delegation to be more aggressive and actually propose legislation to get the ball rolling. Because sometimes it takes 5 years to get that, or 6 years, or a new president to actually make that work. But are we doing enough, and can we do more? It just seems to me that we kind of be treading on a treadmill, and we ought to take a different approach or a more aggressive approach.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. I am certainly more than happy to work with the legislature on whatever that communication should be in the future. We've had those discussions with our delegation. I think, not to be overly blunt, but it comes down to what's being requested, and what would be requested is an act of Congress to fundamentally change that match calculation in statute to account for some of the things that you mentioned, and I certainly don't disagree with. It's difficult to get momentum on that, as I mentioned, just because you do have states, Mississippi, for example, Utah, for example, that have dramatically higher match rates than Wyoming, and would maybe be displeased with that kind of congressional action. And also it's one of those, damned if you do, damned if you don't, where Wyoming's good economics, frankly, over the years have resulted in a lower match rate. But those items that you mentioned, like the scale of healthcare, that's very difficult. Our fixed costs are in many areas are higher just because of our rural and frontier nature. Other costs of healthcare and insurance are higher in Wyoming compared to other places. Quite frankly, is not part of the match calculation. Should there be a request from this body, a resolution, however, whatever that looks like, we would most certainly assist. I hate to be the cynical bearer of bad news. I do think, again, an act of Congress is necessary there.
Go ahead.
So Director Johansson, Senator Guru and I participated with you and members of the executive branch a couple months ago, maybe, with some senior administrators from CMS, and had this conversation, the conversation that Chairman Nicholas brought, and we brought up the King Swartz's community over the hill, and the impact. We talked about our population, we talked about healthcare, and these were senior administrators from Washington, DC that were here, and we had this conversation, and we talked about, and we have since involved congressional delegation in these conversations, and trying to point to not just the rural but the frontier anomalies that exist in Wyoming, and the difficulties that the current CMS regulations as well as the congressional stuff has in place that really challenges our ability to deliver healthcare, both physically and mentally, to the citizens of the state. And my understanding, and I just appreciate you can either confirm or deny that that conversation is taking place, at least at a beginning level, and we anticipate a follow-up on that to kind of keep those balls in the air.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's right. Again, those conversations have been happening, especially on the tail of what was discussed in this committee and in the legislature last session. I think there's options, like I mentioned, to take advantage of higher match rates in certain specific areas where we can, but we will continue to run that up the flagpole at CMS. And as you mentioned, our delegation is certainly aware of the issue.
And so if we were at 60%, I mean, what does that mean in dollars and cents to us?
Mr. Chairman, essentially doing some rough Johansson math here, take 10% of our general fund expenditures in Medicaid, which is significant, and subtract that out. Again, that's not, we could certainly prepare an estimate of what that would look like, but you'd be, in a $1.4 billion biennial program, half of which is general fund, multiply that half by 10%. It's significant.
And what is that number?
Yeah, can you do that in your head?
Johansson math.
Mr. Chairman, my calculator to my left says an estimated $50 million a year.
Annual. So 100 a biennium. Okay.
Moving on, Mr. Chairman, page 24 is our next exception request. It is our number one priority request. This is a request to increase dental reimbursement rates in Medicaid by 25% effective immediately in April. The reason for this, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I have a growing concern about our participation rate of dental providers in Wyoming Medicaid. And as you know, roughly half of our Medicaid population are children, and oral health could not be more important for that population. Over the past several years, but really, especially in the past year or two, we've seen a concerning trend in dental provider participation in Medicaid. I've had a number of conversations with dental practices and the association on why that is, and it comes down to a very simple reason that our rates are just too low. Wyoming Medicaid is actually a very high performer, relatively speaking, nationally when it comes to provider participation. 99% of physicians in Wyoming participate in Medicaid, all of the hospitals, all of the nursing homes. Dentists is where we have been struggling in recent years. This request, as you see, is $1.8 million of general fund, $1.8 million of federal. And that would allow us to do a 25% rate increase, which we think is meaningful. I still have some concern if that is enough, but I think that's a good start in ensuring, especially that our Medicaid kids can have access to the oral health services that they need.
Stephen, how do we, I mean, if I looked into my crystal ball, I would say more of it has to do with the number of dentists practicing in Wyoming, because if you want to get a dentist appointment right now, it's usually 2 to 6 months out. That's how busy they are. And so my question is, if you pay 25% more, but you don't have enough dentists, it's a chicken and the egg.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'll comment on both the chicken and the egg. I do think that the reimbursement rate, again, could have for lack of a better term, a market creating potential. If that pay source is there, if you reference figure 1 on the dental policy brief that we provided the committee, we try to show graphically the number of dentists practicing in Wyoming, and you're right, it has decreased. But you can see a dramatic difference between the trend in Medicaid dental provider participation and the overall number of dentists that are there. So both are certainly declining, but I do think the dramatically lower rate of Medicaid dental providers is correlated to our rates. But both phenomena, you're absolutely right. We see that in a number of provider areas in Wyoming.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So what is your goal? What do you want to get to, and how did you come up with the 25%? What What participation rate would you like to get? We've got some graphs showed 2015, you were at 70%. You're down now. I don't know. It's hard to tell from this graph. You're down to 50%. Less. Where do you want to get back to, and how do you figure that? How did you come up with 25%?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, it's a good question. I'll be honest. It's not a target that I tied directly to here's the percentage rate increase and here's what it will get us to. I would like to see our dental provider rates similar to our physician and other provider participation rates. That's a lofty goal. With our physicians, we 99% estimated participation. I don't know what that 25% rate increase will get us. We can certainly provide data to the committee of how our rates benchmark to private insurance. And you'll see that for some services, it's equitable. For some, it's not. And happy to follow up with you, Chairman Kinski, on the details there. But the 25% rate increase, from my perspective, is an ability to test to see if we can get additional participation.
No, I don't, Mr. Chairman, I don't need a follow-up. It's so you're spitballing the number, and I respect that. That makes sense. And then you're down on orthodontists much more than you are in regular dentists. Are you going to use this 25% to bump the orthodontists up relatively more than you're going to bump the dentists up?
Mr. Chairman, Co-Chairman Kinski, it would be the same for oral health providers.
25%. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, the next request is on page 27. This is our other relatively large request. Spend some time on this one. This is an increase in nursing home reimbursement rates for Wyoming Medicaid. Bear with me, Mr. Chairman. I'll give you the short and sweet version, but it does require a little bit of explanation. As this committee might recall, last year we did a small rebasing, a small increase for nursing home reimbursements in Medicaid. I believe it was about $1.1 million in general funds with a corresponding federal match. The reason for that is, on average, when we look at Medicaid cost coverage in nursing homes, essentially how much of the allowable cost is Medicaid as a payer covering in nursing home reimbursements. On average, we were at about 83%. And that has a variety of factors with it in terms of business model, payer mix in a specific facility. But on average, Wyoming Medicaid was covering about 83% of the cost of care in a nursing home. With you all in discussion with last year's committee or this past year's committee, we increased that by a percentage point, essentially going from 83 to 84% cost coverage. As you know, members of the committee, we've been beating the drum on the long-term care problem for a number of years. Our population continues to age in Wyoming, and Wyoming Medicaid is the largest payer of long-term care services in the state. Approximately 60 to 70% of nursing home bed days statewide are paid for by Medicaid. In addition, members of the committee, we have seen some concerning trends nationally, but also potential bellwether in the state of Wyoming with the closure of a nursing home in the Basin area this year, this past fall. And I think part of that, certainly not the full equation, but part of that does relate to Medicaid reimbursement rates. What this request would do, members of the committee, this would allow the Department of Health to increase reimbursement rates in nursing homes in Wyoming to as close to 100% cost coverage as possible, with one exception. We currently operate with legislative authorization what we call upper payment limit or supplemental payment programs, where we have cost coverage in nursing homes that does not require state general funds. It's a way that we assess providers, we collect the revenue, and we match it with federal funds to grow the pie, and we redistribute it back to the providers. A unique tool without state investment to increase cost coverage. What this request would do is essentially fill that gap between 83 and 84% cost coverage to get as close as we can to 100% cost coverage in nursing homes. And again, from my perspective, I think the investment here in long-term care for our seniors, for those requiring nursing home placement, and given that Medicaid is the largest long-term care payer, would go a long way to stabilizing and sustaining this level of care in Wyoming so that we avoid potential problems that we've seen in neighboring states. The nursing home closures in Montana, for example, have been in the news, and Nebraska have been in the news. And again, members of the committee, there's a lot of reasons for that. And a lot of people here, well, nursing homes close because Medicaid pays too little. I think it's part of the equation, and one that with an investment like this, we could go a long way in sustaining long-term care services in Wyoming. Mr. Chairman, happy to stand for any questions.
Representative Larson first. He's been waiting.
So when we talk about the cost coverage, Director Johansson, am I correct in saying that the cost coverage is the cost coverage allowed by Medicaid, not perhaps what they may have invested, but there's this cost coverage. And then when we refer to that upper payment limit is referring to that limit of cost that Medicaid will allow. And so it's not this random what each one does, but it's what's allowed by Medicaid. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes. Essentially, Medicaid in general is prohibited from paying any more than Medicare would for services. That's what we call the upper payment limit. So nursing homes, just like hospitals, file cost reports with CMS. And that's how their allowable costs get calculated to determine what that upper payment limit is. We are, like I mentioned, we are not allowed as a Medicaid program to exceed that upper payment limit. Right now, with long-term care with nursing homes in this unit, we are averaging about 84% cost coverage. So that gap, exactly what you mentioned, is the gap between our current reimbursement and what our upper payment limit, our allowable reimbursements would be.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, so first of all, the thing that I want to confirm to the committee is we're talking about 44 million per biennium, which is a significantly large number than we've got here. And the 5.5 million is actually 11. You're covering a portion of it out of reversion. So this is a $44 million biennial number. So a dentist has the option to participate or not. So you watch participation rates. Nursing homes don't. You cannot not take Medicaid and be in the nursing home business. Is there anybody you know that doesn't take Medicaid that's in the nursing home business? Maybe in Beverly Hills or something.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, there are certainly nursing homes that you don't have to take Medicaid, but to your point, nursing home care is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
And so even if folks have a large amount of assets going into their retirement savings, if you spend a year or 2 years in a nursing home, we're potentially in the high six figures of cost. So often folks, by nature of that, and their finances, become eligible for Medicaid, and Wyoming Medicaid takes over payment. So you're right, but there are exceptions.
Mr. Chairman, but I don't know of any. Is there a nursing home in Wyoming that doesn't take Medicaid? I don't know of one. There's not. Okay. So all you don't watch the participation rate. You're watching for whether they cave, whether they just go under.
Mr. Chairman, that's right.
So we've had one failure, but you said Medicaid reimbursement is part of the story. I take it there's a lot more to the story than that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, that's right. And there are business model aspects to nursing home sustainability on the financial side that involve payer mix. So for example, if you were a nursing home that only wanted to take Medicaid patients, that cost structure needs to be very low based on Medicaid reimbursements. Whereas Medicare nursing home reimbursements focus on rehabilitation. There's a lot of physical therapy, occupational therapy requiring a higher staffing structure, more nursing, more specialty. And so that cost model is much higher. What we see nationally is you see financial problems if a nursing home that has really built its model on Medicare, rehab, PT, OT type of service, and then relies too heavily on Medicaid client reimbursement, if that makes sense. You see some problems there. But you're absolutely right. The way you described it is true. We have universal participation in Medicaid from nursing homes, but we look in this particular level of care of their sustainability, and not so much if they participate in the program.
So, Mr. Chairman, I know you and your predecessor worked hard on trying to get an idea as to when the rates were approaching where it just wasn't sustainable. I don't know that you ever succeeded in building that model. I hate for one failure, which sounds like there was something other than Medicaid reimbursement, to drive us to try and cover 100% of the cost of 44 million a year. Do you have reason to believe that there are a significant number of other nursing homes that are on the verge of closure?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, two answers to that question. One, I want to be clear that this request would not have Wyoming Medicaid or the Department of Health funding 100% of the nursing home's operations. This is just 100% of the cost of delivering care to Medicaid residents, to Medicaid members. Secondly, your question is a good one, and I might not have a great answer. I do think that with Wyoming Medicaid being the largest payer of these services in nursing homes, that we are such a big part of the equation of nursing home sustainability that you can have a conversation about a nursing home going out of business without talking about these Medicaid rates. And you're right, this is a large request. This would be something that over the years, since I've been here, we've rebased nursing homes twice. Once in 2014, took effect in 2015, and once last year with another 1% cost coverage increase. This would be a dramatic step in sustaining long-term care and nursing facilities around the state. But I certainly won't mince words that you're right. Going forward in biennia in the future, this is a $44 million biennial request, 22 million of which is state general funds. You'll notice, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, the current recommendation from the governor is to not appropriate the full general fund, but to allow us that reversion authority to finance it with some of these savings we may have. But it's important to remember the 2025-26 budget comes around. We're likely talking about making this request whole.
Mr. Chairman, just one follow-up. And I'm sure maybe you look at the data, maybe it's your licensure division, but I know we've got at least one nursing home in our town that keeps changing hands. I don't even know what the name of it is this week. And it's big corporate entities that are buying and selling these things. If it's such a terrible business, it sure attracts a lot of interest from Wall Street for a business that, we're concerned we've got to put more money and get them up to 100% of Medicaid reimbursement. I'm just having a hard time. I'm having a hard time getting there.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, give you kind of half director, half Stefan perspective here. I don't disagree with you on a lot of the business of healthcare. That there's things that financiers want to invest in because there is a return, and sometimes that comes on the back of the public sector. However, what I'm seeing most in nursing home developments around the country and even here in Wyoming, you do see nursing homes shutting down in favor of operating swing beds in hospitals because there is an easier way to make it financially work. What that means for a resident is suddenly, instead of living in a more home-like setting, and I'm not saying all nursing homes are like that, but certainly more than a hospital, which is what a lot of facilities are moving to, is operating swing beds in hospitals. A request like this would, I think, allow long-term care facilities to operate at a more sustainable fashion without having to make some of those moves that you do see private interests and corporations moving towards because it's better for the bottom line. Will this solve the long-term care problem? No, absolutely not. But for our residents that require nursing home care, our Medicaid residents, this gives me greater confidence going forward that we can have places for these folks to go.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
And could you just remind us, as you said, that what your projection of long-term care growth will be over the next, you pick the time?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I don't have that number in front of me, but if memory serves, every year, when we did the report in 2016, we were projecting a $16 million general fund cost growth, and we've largely been on track in that in long-term care.
And a follow-up on this, and Kevin, this might be to you, if you look at page 29, on there. So on that, the supplemental budget request, 11 million of that is general fund. The governor recommends 11 million out of a supplemental general fund appropriation ongoing. And then he takes 5.5 million out of reversions and refers to it in that unit 5048. So my question is, is the intent of the 5048 to use the reversions that we appropriated last year and they've not, or that's for new reversions that would be collected? And do we have to designate that? Do we have to appropriate those reversions to be? Is there a process? Are we missing a step here? Do we have to somehow commit those?
Mr. Chairman, I believe I accept the governor's recommendation to do that.
Okay. Don?
Mr. Chairman, in the budget bill, I don't think that $5.5 million of reversions will appear. And my rationale for that is you've already been appropriated that. You have the super flexibility to move the money as you see fit. So that 5.5 won't show up in that other funds column, but they already have the authority to do it.
Mr. Chairman.
And so is there something there that we need to correct, or are we okay?
Mr. Chairman, I think you can just adopt the governor's recommendation if you are in favor of this request, knowing that 5.5 million on page 29 under revenue code 5048 will not appear in the bill.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, question: of every 100 nursing home residents, about how many are private pay? Is it 10%? Is it 20%?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, that's a great question. I'll have to get back to you on the math there. I know that, again, we approached, or we're approaching over 60%, close to 65% were Medicaid. I would need to go check the breakdown on private pay, essentially self-pay versus Medicare or any other long-term care insurance.
And Mr. Chairman, follow up. How much difference would it make long-term if you were able to increase the share of private pay, perhaps by people having greater retirement savings, for example? How much difference would that make if you could increase the amount by, say, 5% or so?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, if, again, we don't have control in the department to mandate that of what facilities collect, but I think relatively speaking, it would be de minimis for that kind of, if a facility decided to up their private pay rates, they do. When folks don't have Medicare days that are available or don't qualify yet for Medicaid, you see facilities over the years ratcheting up their private pay rates. Quite frankly, we've done the same thing at our nursing home. But what that ends up doing long-term is folks just spend down their assets quicker and come on to the Medicaid program faster.
Okay, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, closing out on this topic to Co-Chairman Kinski's question, I do think it's relevant to mention we currently have 2 nursing facilities on what we call distressed rates. The facility that closed earlier this fall, we had also put a distressed rate in, meaning they apply to us on financial hardship, potential closure. We evaluate that based on state and federal rules and a methodology we have. We have 2 additional facilities now that are currently on distressed rates, which we can authorize for 6 months with an extension of up to a year.
How many facilities are there?
Mr. Chairman, I have to get back to you on that. I believe they're in the northwestern part of the state and then close here in Carbon County.
But how many total seniors?
2 facilities are on distressed rates right now. 1 has requested a distressed rate.
How many total nursing homes?
Mr. Chairman, I believe it's around 30. Have to double check that figure, but it's around 30 nursing homes.
Nursing homes.
Long-term care facilities.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
Mr. Chairman, the next,
Does that include the retirements?
Mr. Chairman, it does.
Okay.
I will be clear, though, that this this request would not be, is not specific to the Wyoming Retirement Center, who as a state-owned nursing home has a different rate methodology. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the next request on page 30, basically a federal spending authority request, $45 million of what we call IHS or Indian Health Services federal funding. Just as a quick reminder, Wyoming and other states have an agreement with the federal government that for Medicaid members who are also tribal and receive services at IHS qualifying facilities or providers, the federal government pays 100% of the cost. This is just spending authority to make sure that the general fund is not exposed here for that type of Medicaid reimbursement. This would all be federal funding.
And Mr. Chairman. So, and that's not, that they can be of any official tribe as long as they're receiving services or referred to by an RHS facility for that reimbursement, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that's correct, yes. Mr. Chairman, the next request is on page 35 in our behavioral health division. This is the second position that I requested this year, would be in our behavioral health division. As I mentioned, we have had a dramatic increase, especially in recent years, in the number of crisis cases that we are managing. And what I mean by that are high needs youth, very, very acute, multiple comorbidities, extreme behaviors, autism spectrum, et cetera, that we struggle to find appropriate care and placement for. Most of the time, there's not, the waiver providers are not available. Other facilities in the state cannot or will not take these clients, and they don't fit neatly into these buckets. It's usually the Department of Health, the Department of Family Services, and the Department of Education coordinating at any given time about 15 to 20 of these cases on an ongoing basis. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this would allow me to provide some support to my behavioral health division to be a coordinating entity for these types of cases. Because right now it is truly across 3 agencies on the backs of staff that this is another duties as assigned type work. We will continue to do it, but this would go a long way, especially for the coordination of our really high need youth in this state that are in crisis, to do a little bit better intake and coordination on what services, what programs, what placements and facilities might be available, so that we become a bit less reactive on these cases and a bit more proactive, coordinating the funding, the eligibility, the services that are available in Medicaid, in the Medicaid waiver programs, in our community mental health centers, in our developmental preschools, in our DFS field office. They do a lot of work with us on a voluntary basis on this. These are kids that might not be in their custody, but they do their best to help out. And then certainly the Department of Education on the special education side. This would be, in my view, a small investment to provide some much better coordination for these kids and their families. With that, Mr. Chairman, happy to stand for any questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So how many people are we estimating this person will be assisting? And the second piece of that, currently without this FTE, what's the time gap between application and getting the assistance?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, in terms of the volume that I think this person would be dedicated to, probably about 15 to 20 at any given time. But it does fluctuate dramatically depending on who's out there. In terms of the time gap, it's a good question. I'll respond to it this way, that there really is no set protocol in this type of work, because what we're dealing with these crisis cases are when other eligibilities or programs have broken down. So we don't have, this kid does not qualify or cannot be provided services by a community waiver provider or in just general Medicaid state plan or in a psychiatric residential treatment facility that has said no, or they've blown out of that setting, or a residential treatment center. So what we're essentially doing is looking around the country, looking to get creative within the state of Wyoming with other types of providers to get kids out of detention centers, out of emergency rooms, and out of settings that are frankly we're pleased that they're safe, but it's really just not an appropriate setting for a child. I know it's a frustrating answer, Representative Schwartz, but there really isn't a set rubric here. This would be a coordinator that can help my office and my staff kind of layer on top of all of these different programs that we have and coordinate among them in a way that we don't do currently.
Chairman, go ahead.
So Director Johansson, if I have it correctly, in some of these instances, you're required to provide the therapy or the medical DFS, the housing, and then education has to provide education. So then once you get that coordinated in frankly, we might say that that's been a gap in our state as we've done this mental health redesign and we find this gap and we don't have a policy. So as you establish that, and when you do find something, not only are you finding something, but then there's a requirement to monitor and see how that's going that fits into this as well, does it not?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that's right. And it's certainly included in the description here that we have staff now, frankly, it used to be me in the deputy director role, trying to keep track and follow up on these cases that, again, didn't fit neatly into buckets. We might place a child in a facility out of state, and we don't want to wash our hands and say, well, great, the child's been placed. We want active management, whether they're Medicaid eligible, DFS custody, or education funded or not, to bring them back closer to home and stabilize them in their own communities, as opposed to out of sight, out of mind in a different state. So yes, sir, you're absolutely right.
Okay, proceed.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll flip to the next page, page 36, this is a request, $5 million for investment in behavioral health for the behavioral health redesign. The continuation bill on the behavioral health reform was passed last session. It did have legislative language that required us to bring a request here of either ARPA funds or general funds. This would essentially be what I'll call seed money or investment in the redesign for the community mental health programs that we discussed a few minutes ago. We know that going towards implementation of July 1st of 2024, there will be system costs in terms of modernizing eligibility, claims processing, et cetera, that we intend to, as I mentioned previously, leverage our newly procured Medicaid system. We also know that our providers will need investment to change a lot of the way they do business in terms of the level of care that they provide, the type of acuity in the clients that they will see with the new priority populations. We believe that this is a good investment as a placeholder. I can't tell you, aside from those general categories that I mentioned, exactly where it will be spent. We have one more year of behavioral health redesign implementation with our providers per the statute that we will focus on in this next calendar year. I anticipate that, as I mentioned, we'll have system costs, and the state may want to invest in residential capacity building, conversion of certain types of residential spaces that we currently have in the community mental health centers that may or may not be applicable to the types of populations that we will be giving them in the future. Things like hardening rooms or converting different types of residential beds to crisis beds, et cetera. This is, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, more of a placeholder for next year's implementation of the redesign. But as you'll see in the legislative language there, it is something we've been asked to bring forward and something that I certainly support as the director. I will close here and mention that we did consider an American Rescue Plan Act or an ARPA request here, given some of the areas where I think this money will likely need to go as part of the reform or redesign. I think ARPA eligibility would be a steep hill to climb. Things like system costs, et cetera. But we are certainly more than happy to do that legwork over the final year of the reform implementation as we get closer to what those expenditures might be to convert that to an ARPA request. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I will say if this money is appropriated, we certainly aren't going to go day one spending it frivolously. We will use this only for the implementation of that redesign, and happy to report back to the committees or bring it back to this committee, closer to next year's budget to see where these expenditures might be needed.
So Stefan, why wouldn't we put language that said that to the extent it does apply, that it will be ARPA dollars, and then have a certain amount or certain component to it that allows you general funds for those, for what doesn't qualify?
Mr. Chairman, I do believe that would be workable. Again, it was kind of a choice in the request. Wanted to keep it as simple as possible. We'll talk about one in a minute where last session you all did appropriate money for the home services program and say, to the extent possible, use ARPA funds unless you certify or deem that it's ineligible. We could certainly work something like that into this request.
It certainly makes more sense to me to go that, to take that approach.
Mr. Chairman.
So Don, would you make a note of that and then work with the language so we can at least have it handy? Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson. So in Senate File 66 last year, $5 million was appropriated for the Health and Human Services Innovation Fund. Have you already spent that money on other things? Or if some of that money is available, could you use it for this behavioral health redesign?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I'm glad you asked. The applications for those innovation grants were due on September 1st. We received across innovation, capital improvements, and provider relief over 100 applications. We have finished all of the decision-making on those. The money has not been spent, but it is obligated to various projects that we're now working with the budget office and their contractors on eligibility, and with the providers on contracts and agreements.
Okay, please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, the next request is on page 42. This is generally a placeholder every year for the growth in our developmental preschools. Again, page 42, unit 2510. Every year we bring a placeholder request that the governor always denies because our child count is not updated until December 1st. That child count has been updated. And this request will need to be modified. I'll have our CFO, Eric McVicker, give you the updated numbers that we received last week.
Members of the committee, Eric McVicker, Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Health. This request and the ECA kind of go together because it depends on what you guys approve for the ECA as far as what the per child dollar amount is going to be. There was an addition of 25 kids, so we had a placeholder of 50. There were 25 additional children that we would need. What we did here is that $11,219, that number would be accurate if you approved all of the ECA, because that's what we're bringing to you, is we have to bring in the totality of what that ECA would be. So that's kind of the ceiling.
What's that number again?
It's there, the $11,219.45. That's if you approve the $11 million ECA next request.
Mr. Chairman, what the number I'm looking for is at the current per child amount with 25 extra children, instead of 560,973, the number is what?
Mr. Chairman, that's what it depends on what you approve on the ECA. So
Mr.
if you
Chairman.
if you approve just the 1.9 million that we have here, which is the current amount, then the total request would be $214,328. So it's 25 children by 8,500 roughly per child amount. If you didn't do anything at all and didn't approve anything on the ECA, the child count would remain 25. It would be 8,300 per, and the request would be 207,500. So I wish we had a better answer for you, but it really depends on what you guys do on the ECA as to what we pay for the child count amount, if that makes sense.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
but based on the governor's rec, Eric, to do the 1.9, it would be at the 214,000.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, that's correct.
And Mr. Chairman, if I can just close this description for both this request and the one that you'll find on page 43 and 44, we are required by law and by legislate to ask for every ECA that has been unfunded over the years. So it gets a little bit confusing. But to put it simply, our child count increased by 25 children. And if you were to approve the child count increase and the external cost adjustment that the governor recommended on the next page, which is 1.9 million, the total request on page 42 would be $214,328.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, skipping to our final request on page 49. This is the second year of the biennial funding for the Wyoming Home Services Program.
We need to talk about the ECA.
Mr. Chairman, happy to go back on page.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. Did you do that already?
Mr. Chairman, I thought we had, but happy to.
So can I ask a question though on that, Mr. Chairman? So on that funding with that ECA, do we that 1.9 is a cost adjustment, but we don't biennialize it? Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is right. Anytime there's an ECA in the K through 12 system, because we are required to bring the same external cost adjustment percentage to the developmental preschools, we bring that, and I believe it does not biennialize.
It does not biennialize, so that doesn't impact our our MOC maintenance or MOE, our maintenance of effort. Maintenance of effort would just be at the infusion of that 1.9 into that whole thing and does not need to be biennialized. Is that right, Eric?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, that is correct. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, our final request on page 49. This is the second year of the biennial funding for the Wyoming Home Services Program, Unit 5002. As you may recall, last session, we requested the funding for the Home Services Program through footnote number 5. This committee directed us gave us the first year of funding and directed us to come back this year for the second year of funding, so long as we met the obligations in footnote number 5. Those were to certify that the ARPA funding of $2.7 million was not eligible to be used. In conjunction with the budget office, we did determine that ARPA funding, that would be supplanting, which was not allowed by the ARPA funds. The second condition was to develop or provide you with performance metrics for the program. We've done that through our health stat program in the department, where the Wyoming Home Services Program does have the entire value chain there of outcomes, outputs, efficiencies, et cetera, that have been provided to you. And last, but certainly not least, penultimate condition was to work with the federal government, negotiate for a potential waiver that would essentially replace the Wyoming Home Services Program's general fund obligations. We, with the leadership of Mr. Fuchs here to my left, work with the senior centers and the providers, as well as the federal government, with numerous conversations with CMS to develop a waiver concept that would meet the intent of footnote number 5. I can tell you as your health director, I was very pleased with the process and the engagement from the senior centers, from the providers, and quite frankly, from CMS. We know they won't say yes or no until we submit an application, but their assistance and their engagement on the topic was very good in my estimation. We ultimately, through the report we shared with you, did not recommend that particular waiver, and for a variety of reasons that we're happy to elaborate on. But that was one of the conditions of footnote number 5, and that report has been shared with you. The final condition was to implement means testing in this Wyoming Home Services Program before June 30th of next year of 2023. The Home Services Program and our Community Living Section Administrator, Mr. Clark, who's behind me, has worked with the providers this year to stand up means testing. Right now, we've done it voluntarily on current members since we're prior to the June 30th, 2023 deadline. And about half of our current members we have collected income data on. All new members that are coming into home services are also being assessed for income for potential eligibility standards down the road. So we do have income data on those folks. And About 80%, a little more than 80% do fall under 100% of the federal poverty level when you assess income through whether that's a job, Social Security, interest, capital gains, whatever those would be allowable in the IRS in terms of adjusted gross income. We do not assess assets. So things like a house, boat, a yacht, if that existed, would not be assessed as part of this. Part of the reason for that is that the idea behind this program is to keep folks in their home. But my report to this committee is, in terms of the means testing, we are ready to, unless otherwise directed, to implement that means testing across the board and formally. I think there's pros and cons to implementing that, but we have done the work to stand that up. In accordance with that and meeting those 4 conditions, we are requesting the second year of funding for this program to continue the operations for another year. Mr. Chairman, happy to stand for questions.
So I've seen the information you put together with the senior centers for means testing, and it was quite impressive. And so good job and thank you for that. And so now it's a sliding fee scale that seems a bit more realistic. So let me ask, if somebody has an income that puts them on a $60 visit, they're to pay 20. I take it the state pays the other 40. Do you get an audit record of that so that you know exactly what those records are, and you're going to be going back and auditing? Because that's not anything you've been doing up to this point, I don't think, or have you?
Mr. Chairman, we do have data on the cost sharing that happens in the program. And as you mentioned, it's historically been on a sliding fee scale, and we haven't done, Medicaid style eligibility work in this program like we do in our long-term care programs in Medicaid. However, to your point, one concern that I have in implementing this means testing as is, in looking at the income of the participants that we currently have in the program, we actually have in some cases, better cost sharing from the members than we would if we implemented the standard that, as you referenced, we've designed or worked with the providers on. So I do want to be careful as we approach June 30th of 2023, that we have the flexibility to make sure we're not reducing cost sharing in this program, because that does help offset the state's cost there.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, and so you'll be tracking the number of participants and all that sort of thing, and the number of days that you estimate you may have postponed hospitalization. And then let's talk about the waiver. You said that you were pleased with what your department was able to do, the senior centers and CMS. You thought you came up with this is what I heard, a pretty good waiver. And in your memo, I thought you were trying to dampen expectations if you did proceed forward, which is always prudent. But why would you not go forward with it? Everything I read in there, I was surprised that you concluded not to go forward with it, because everything in there made me somewhat optimistic. I think you said there were 2 other states that applied that it's like a bank. They just never tell you yes, they never tell you no. You just hang and twist slowly in the wind. But I don't know what those other 2 applicants were like. Ours clearly would be superior, I would assume. Why would you reiterate for me? Why not proceed forward? What have we got to lose?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have Mr. Fuchs elaborate on this, but I'll answer generally that from my assessment of the potential for this waiver, in addition to the administrative nightmare that 1115 waivers bring and the time that it takes for CMS approval, that aside, demonstrating budget neutrality on this program using Wyoming Home Services program structure and providers now would be difficult. And as a reminder for the committee, Section 1115 waivers that we're talking about here, the feds require federal budget neutrality, meaning this program won't cost them any more than if we didn't have the program. I think that would be difficult and would require a variety of kind of moratorium on enrollment in Wyoming Home Services to get there. So that's number one. And number 2, becoming waiver providers in any of our waiver programs, that is not without complexity and burden. For this particular provider group to become Medicaid waiver providers with what's required, with what you have to demonstrate, I think, quite frankly, that would be a steep hill to climb, and we might not see the kind of participation that in the waiver program that we would have from those providers in the current structure. But I'll hand it over to Mr. Fuchs for any additional comments he might have.
Thank you, Chairman Nicholas, Chairman Kinski. at the end of the day, when we were talking to CMS, we're crafting this waiver proposal to try to meet federal constraints, state statute constraints of the WISE program, and of course, the provider interests themselves. And the main stumbling block really is the unlimited asset and income eligibility that is currently allowable under state statute. So that was never going to happen with CMS. I mean, they're not going to tell us no officially, but that, was the message. So in order to proceed with a waiver, try to shoehorn this existing program into a waiver, we would have to modify the state statute to basically impose probably a 300% of SSI or some kind of, comparable limit to maybe they're willing to entertain options above Medicaid eligibility, but not an unlimited open-ended income and asset eligibility. So that was the primary stumbling block for why we don't believe that this current waiver cannot be approved.
So a change of state statute seems relatively straightforward to me, and you've given that 80% of the participants are under, I can't remember what it's, the average gross income or something. Just assuming that we were to change those state statutes for assets and income, you have some idea what they would have to be, and that would improve our prospects. What I'm concerned about is this program was senior centers, and I get it. There was a lot of pressure to implement it. They're already talking about expanding it, and the number of seniors is growing. So I can see this number just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, even with the changes that we've made. And I don't know at what point you decide that the paperwork hassle of a 1115 waiver is offset by what is undoubtedly going to be a much larger number.
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Kinski, our recommendation in this report was not just to stop. We recommended two options. One would be doing the same as you suggested, changing the state statute and having WISE transforming into a vehicle that would be acceptable with those limited income and asset eligibility guidelines. But the other option could be, we have an existing waiver, the community choices waiver under Medicaid. We could also look at just expanding eligibility under that as well. And so you wouldn't be using the WISE network. You wouldn't be using the WISE statutes. You'd just be expanding the eligibility under the existing Medicaid waiver and looking, that's what other states have really done when they're looking at that sort of pre-institutional waiver that have been approved by Washington, Minnesota, New York, and other states.
So, Mr. Chairman, what would it take for us to roll the WIHI's program into the existing community waiver?
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Kinski, we could certainly suggest some statute changes to that, but it could, affect people that are currently on the program. They may no longer be, the vast majority, of course, below 100% of the poverty level. But if we do change the statutes and say, now you're limited to this, that would change the program at the end of the day.
And Mr. Chairman, I might mention Co-Chairman Kinski that I changing the waiver structures, whether we're amending a current waiver like our community choices waiver, what we typically refer to as our long-term care waiver, or implementing a new waiver will take time. We're talking at a minimum of 12 to 18 months. So that I don't think we certainly cannot get that done between now and July 1st of which would be the second year of this biennium.
Mr. Chairman, that wouldn't be my expectation, but when you say it'll change the program, that's very non-specific, and I don't want to continue to belabor it here, but I'd like to get a little bit more information on what ways it would change it so that I can understand and perhaps the rest of the committee can understand.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Coacher, happy to have that discussion, follow up with you offline.
Thank you.
So as I read, tagging on to Chairman Kinski's point, when I looked at that recommendation on a possibility of implementing a waiver was to expand the eligibility or to further define the eligibility and use a mechanism that is already established, which would be that LT 101 that we use for long-term care. But then that would expand that long-term care service. We could expand it past that community choices waiver to include a broader population and include perhaps the same providers to deliver those services if we got that done. Did I track that accurately? And so it would take into account that income level, asset level, things that we already have in the long-term care.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes. if we expanded the current long-term care waiver to target this type of population, which we call pre-institutional, that we're essentially trying to catch people before they qualify for nursing home placement and provide a lighter menu of services that might delay or prevent that institutionalization, then yes, many of these providers that we're talking about currently are community choices waivers providers, but not all of them. So I think if we were to take that option that Mr. Fuchs mentioned, just to expand our current waiver for a pre-institutional population, some of those providers could already qualify and participate, some would not. And it would be open to a broader network of providers like we have currently in the long-term care waiver.
And so then, Mr. Chairman, the downside of that, if I understood the conversation thus far, is if we went to that, there may be some that are receiving services now that wouldn't qualify or it'd be reduced on that, and we just have to flesh that out on the impacts of on people currently being served. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes.
Okay.
Do we know roughly how many folks that would capture?
Mr. Chairman, we could certainly provide that. Look to Mr. Clark. I believe this program serves a couple thousand individuals.
Mr. Chairman,
So if we could follow up, Mr. Chairman, so then if we were interested in having you do that, do we need to give you authorization to, is there something statutory to pursue that expansion of the long-term care waiver, or what's the mechanics of doing that we would need to do legislatively?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I believe the footnote 5 language that's in the current budget bill, we could suggest amended language there for what would, because it is specific to the home services program now. If we're talking about a general redesign or expansion of the current long-term care waiver to achieve a similar purpose, I think that would be a small tweak, but we could certainly, at the committee's request, provide that suggested language.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Just I hasten to add, before anybody gets concerned about it would affect people currently on the program. One, we're talking a long ways away and a remote prospect. I don't want anybody to get upset thinking they're going to lose something. Two, we could grandfather them. I mean, we have grandfathered people on community services waivers now, couldn't we?
Mr. Chairman, Chairman Kinski, yes, it just, as you know, it comes with a cost to do that, to continue to provide services as an off-ramp.
Well, what's the average length of service on?
Mr. Chairman,
It's not years, I don't think.
Mr. Chairman and Chairman Kinski, I believe it's around 2 years. But keep in mind that this is not the same kind of waiver care and coverage or services that the Medicaid waiver provides in terms of, full medical, home modifications, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that concludes our budget presentation. Happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
So one question, if we can back up just to the eligibility and the sliding scale, the way the write-up says is clients of any income level are eligible. So, and then there's a sliding scale, but the way I understand that due to the write-up, that anybody's eligible regardless of income. So what would somebody that is, say, 100 or 1,000% of the federal poverty level, what are they going to pay? 2 cents or 1/2 of 1/10%? Why isn't there just a cutoff level when you get to a certain level of that federal poverty level?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, it's a good question, and I can have Mr. Clark give you what our cost sharing would be, or we can provide that to you. In the current structure of home services, we don't have many of those clients, frankly, and we found that out this year on the committee's direction to look and start collecting income information. And as I mentioned, the vast majority are under 100% of the federal poverty level. 90+% are under 150% of the poverty level. But happy to, Jeff, if you could opine or provide the data on what the cost sharing would be for home
I just
services.
want to shame the 1 or 2 people out there that are way above that.
Mr. Chairman, so do I. So we're happy to provide that information.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Jeff Clark from the Community Living section.
You can move that
Chairman-
just a little closer.
Yeah. Chairman Nicholas, Senator Hicks, right now, the program, our providers, if we have folks that fall into that 1,000% of poverty level, ultimately, they're just asking them to pay the full cost of that service as business themselves. So if they hit that level, I think we go all the way up to 400%, if I remember correctly. After that, those folks are just paying 100% of the cost per
Okay,
service.
that's what I want to make sure there's some cap in place.
Okay.
And just real quick, how many do we have that are above the 150% level again? And then if you have it, what's the highest percent?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, I'll see if Jeff can provide that quickly. If not, we can follow up. It's a small number.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead. You got it?
Yeah, I think so. So I would say it's under 5% right now that are hitting that level
5%.
Of the clients that we've assessed so far.
150.
Yeah.
Okay, Representative Walters.
Mr. Chairman, the Supreme Court is proposing moving drug courts away from Department of Health into the court system. Just your feedback and thoughts on that, please.
Mr. Chairman, Representative. Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, I have worked and have a good collaboration with Chief Justice Fox and her staff on that, and certainly participated in Joint Judiciary Committee's meetings on that topic. Early on, I had concerns about the moving those programs without the adequate plan in place to make sure that, whether it was on the IT and data system side or the procurement and contract management side, that we wouldn't see disruptions to the programs that we have. And I'm comfortable now, if those programs moved, we would have an MOU in place. The current bill draft, as I understand it, kicks out the full implementation of that an additional year, which would give us time to partner with the Supreme Court, work with them on that transition. As you probably know, there's a lot of different states that do those programs differently and house those programs in the judiciary or in the Department of Corrections. So there's a variety of different models, but we've been working hand in hand with the Supreme Court to make sure that if that transition happened, that it would not only be minimally disruptive, but successful. That's certainly what we want. So I'm certainly supportive of that bill now that we have the plans in place.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr.
Oh,
Chairman.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of seed planting, listening to how challenging these waivers are, I would like to follow up on a conversation we've had via email, where we see some states now using the waiver program to fund nutrition programs. So just to say that out loud for my colleagues, our local interfaith brought to my attention this potential tool that would help make nutritious food easily accessible to people who are fighting diet-related diseases. And so that's a follow-up conversation I'd love to have with you. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I appreciate the exchanges we've had and that you've had with staff. We often feel like the official throwers of wet blankets around here, that there's ideas and we say, well, you can't do that because of this, and there's complexity here. I just, as an aside, I would mention that anytime we're talking about waivers, I want the committee and the legislature to understand it always involves waiving federal law. So we're identifying components that we are saying, here's what's in the Social Security Act in this particular section. We would like to waive that, whether it's eligibility, whether it's service provision, because we want to do something different. And so it's important to remember, especially for your stakeholders, that waivers are not a program that the feds have to say, do what you want, be flexible, here's a waiver. We need to be very specific on what we're waiving. And then there are tools, financial policy vehicles through waivers that we can work on. They often come with cost and admin, but happy to have those follow-up discussions, Representative.
Senator Grew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to Representative Walters' question about the drug court. When you say you feel it can be successful, one of the problems that I've always noticed is tracking success, especially if it goes over to the judicial side. They're very, as they should be, they like to keep their records sealed and private, but it's hard then to track success back to some of the programs that you all have. So when you talk about that you're comfortable with that, do you feel that you're going to be able to keep track of that and keep track of the success of the people in the program from your point of view, from the program point of view that you have?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, if the program's moved, I'm done with them. No, that's a little bit facetious, but They certainly would be operated by a different agency, different branch of government. We have over the years, set up those, how we track success, and it's basically on retention rates, graduation rates, those types of things that we can compare nationally. I think the program and the structure we have now to track that performance could easily be translated over to whether you put them in another agency or you put these programs in the judiciary. I'm comfortable that that happens nationally. And there's standards of what you track. So I'm comfortable that would continue under a different operation.
Thank you. Now to separate line, the new facility in Buffalo. I know you touched on it briefly. Could you give me a status update? Where are we? What's happening? Just kind of an overall, just quick.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, we are getting close to getting all of the buildings handed over to us on final completion. Like I mentioned, there's been a few construction delays and a few punch list items that we're still waiting for repair on, mostly, as I mentioned, on the cottage that will house our higher acuity, especially on the mental health side, those folks. We're in the process of recruiting our leadership positions at that facility. It's been a struggle in timing because we need the buildings, and then we have to staff, and then we have to certify and do survey work, both with CMS and the feds through the VA. So that's been a tricky challenge to line up, that completion with the type of work that needs to happen. But we're making progress.
Follow.
Go ahead.
So fair enough to say it's too early to talk about staffing levels or how that's going. Until you get a leadership team together, you haven't really gotten that far yet, basically.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Guru, at the Veterans Nursing Home, no, we have not started recruiting the line nurses and the CNAs that will be providing the direct care. It's been, as I mentioned, a challenge for me of when to give that authorization to recruit those, because we don't want to bring 15, 20 CNAs on and have nothing for them to do. And now there is a time lag on when we need to train them up, and we're doing a greenhouse model of care. So it will likely be definitely be before we bring the first patient in. But that's what we're lining up. And I would anticipate that probably in terms of full staffing and full operations, we're going to begin the process of bringing patients in February or March.
Okay. Can you keep us up to date with that?
Happy to.
Thanks. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that reminded me one last thing. I did want to, as you've asked other agencies in terms of your discussion on state employee compensation, just to remind the committee of the 5 direct care facilities that the department operates. We are really struggling on staffing, as I mentioned in my introductory comments. At the state hospital, they're doing excellent work, but we have a 65% nurse vacancy rate right now. We're filling that with contractors as best we can at an expense that's not sustainable. Same story at the retirement center. We're looking in the 40-50% vacancy rate on nurses. And at the Life Resource Center, our biggest need there, both with nurses and what we call DSPs, direct service providers, but similar to a CNA. The Department of Health is in dire need. And I've always said to this committee that compensation is part of that equation. There's other parts to it. So we were very pleased last year with what the legislature did in terms of compensation, especially in the safety net facilities we operate. And any further discussion on that could benefit our ability to recruit and retain these key positions would be welcomed. It has trickle-down effects to your communities through Title 25, Title 7, people waiting in your county jails, in your emergency rooms to get into our facilities. I'm acutely aware of that. And our wait times and wait lists are frankly unacceptable. And I do think compensation, especially at those direct care positions that are really tough when you work in a state psychiatric hospital or the Life Resource Center, these are not easy populations. Our ability to recruit and retain those, again, your discussions and consideration of employee compensation as has been presented is greatly appreciated. With that, thank you.
Representative.
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, in that vein, and perhaps this is a question for next Wednesday with the governor's letters, but I understand there's a relatively large request for Health and Human Services stabilization funding. you're probably aware there was a Wall Street Journal article from 10 days or so ago looking at 2,000 hospitals that received federal COVID-related monies. And their analysis was that 1,200 of those hospitals didn't really need the money, that they would have shown a profit anyway. Do you need this extra money? And perhaps that's a question for next Wednesday.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, I think I'll be here on Wednesday to speak to that. I would say the state of Wyoming through the staffing stabilization grants, I think we've done a decent job in targeting the providers most in need. The legislation that established our most recent program required us to prioritize. And so we have not funded hospitals and nursing homes since the first round almost 2 years ago of staffing stabilization funds that went out to try to retain the folks that hospitals and nursing homes needed. I think that was largely successful, albeit a drop in the bucket. The most recent round really targeted providers around the state that take care of the most vulnerable. So DD providers, residential treatment centers, psychiatric residential treatment facilities for youth. And those, I think that's gone well. I am aware of the article and especially other studies in CARES and ARPA funds of mismanagement of those. With our partnership with the Hospital Association, we actually have rooms of audit logs and paperwork that has been collected to make sure we're not falling outside of those boundaries of what's allowable. So in the most part, Representative Stith, I think we've largely avoided some of those pitfalls.
Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So after the compensation issue, do you have any sense of how much housing is a component of the issue?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, it's a great question. I can't put my finger on the pulse there. We see it in Lander with folks commuting from Riverton or other places because Lander housing is expensive. We see it in outside of our state facilities, but certainly with programming that we have in Teton County and other places that it does become a big part of the issue, as does childcare. I struggle with the state's responsibility on directly providing those things as opposed to helping support availability or access. It's a difficult question. Given that the state hospital is in close proximity to Salt Lake City, we do draw quite a bit from that area, and we do have folks that commute. And thankfully, we're able in some cases to provide on-campus housing for the 3, 4, or 5 days that they do stay there, but it's certainly not universal.
Okay.
I mean, that's more what I was getting at. And I guess the follow-up then is, I assume you do exit interviews when you lose employees, which is part of the problem. And I don't need the information. I just hope you're tracking that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, yes, it is voluntary. Folks don't have to do an exit interview, but we certainly collect the data on the ones that do. Mostly it's compensation. It's some of the logistical things like you mentioned, but mostly compensation and I don't like my boss. That's typically the two categories that we see. But again, it's I think we have some tools to help with that, especially at our facilities to offer on-campus housing to the extent that folks want it. But especially on the nurse side, Representative Schwartz, most recently, the biggest exit that I've seen from our facilities is for traveling work for agencies that are paying enormous amounts of money per hour for a nurse. And also to other providers who do sign-on bonuses, things that we can't compete with. But it's a dynamic, it's a back and forth. We raise rates for certain positions in the state, and at that moment, we're out competing the local nursing home or the local hospital, and then they raise rates for CNAs or nurses or psych techs or what have you. And it's always a back and forth because we exist together in small towns in Wyoming, and we certainly don't want to destabilize the workforce by recruiting at our facilities. But as safety net facilities, we have a duty by law to operate Title 25 services for people who are committed, to operate the Life Resource Center for the folks that we have to take. And so I have to recruit those facilities.
So, Director Johansson, have you ever considered maybe having the University of Wyoming go back into the high schools and advertise and help people to go into nursing and the benefits of nursing and think about really stimulating focusing some money to those careers?
Mr. Chairman, I sense
You don't
that
have
was
to answer.
rhetorical.
Inside joke.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate it, Stefan. Okay, we'll take a JAC break and we'll come back and play with the bill. Okay, Brian, walk us through our changes real quick, will you, please?
Yep. So Mr. Chairman, 23 also 100. This is, you should have working draft 0.10. I will just go through the changes that were made to the draft from this morning. So starting on page 2, really from line 7 on, that is the new language for the interest rate for the farm loans. Subsection A is just generally provides that it shall be equal to the yield on a United States Treasury security of the same duration of the loan. The next sentence, the new inserted sentence on line 14, is that the board may add an additional percentage not to exceed 2% as a risk premium, and then the rate of interest shall not be less than 3%. Subsection B is for the beginning agriculture producer loans, and it's the same language. It would be Treasury security of the same duration, 2% risk premium. Now I'm on page 3, lines 4 through 8, and then a minimum rate of 3%. The next changes from this morning would be on page 7. And I would note first the staff comment on page 6. Page 6 is the language for the existing Joint Powers Act loans in terms of who is eligible. And I would note on lines 14 and 15 of page 6 that the SLIB may negotiate and make loans to one or more agencies. Agency is defined, now I'm looking on the top of page 7, to mean, among other entities, special districts specifically involved in providing facilities or functions enumerated in 16.1.104C. That is the language that I inserted on page 7, lines 14 and 15. Rather than just reference special districts, it would keep that language the same unless the committee desires otherwise to make it open really to any special district. Then page 7, lines 20 through 28 are the change to the interest rate for the infrastructure and road and street loans. Page 8, line 22 is the new language for specifically the road or street project loans. And then page 9, beginning line 26 is the same interest language for irrigation loans under that same section as well, under 16.1.111. Mr. Chairman, those are the changes from this morning. Happy to answer questions.
Go ahead.
Just a repetitive assist to that, right? And then you'll see the same thing on page 8, line 22. We just need to strike that.
To the. Yeah, that would be. We've already moved it. Okay, got that. Anything else? That definitely simplifies the bill, makes it a little easier to understand.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious, has the committee ever had any discussion about the length of the loans? My concern is a 30-year loan seems like an awful long time to be borrowing out state funds, but I don't know if that discussion's come up, and it's irrelevant if it hasn't.
So on some of those, I thought there were some 20-year restrictions, at least on some of them, or at one point in time, but I don't know the answer to that.
The dorms are 25. Up to, the dorms are up to 25. And I think the local infrastructure was up to 25.
There was one question, by the way, that if, based upon the CapCon demand that we'll see tomorrow on the dorms, depending on what we do, they may want to have the opportunity to take advantage of a loan. But if we did that on the dorms, I mean, we'd have to extend the date to April 24 or something like that. As a last court.
And Mr. Chairman, I checked with staff. They still have that borrowing authority, and I think it's one of the options they're considering. What would you want to extend?
Just the ability of,
The interest rate, give them an extension under the current program.
yeah.
I think the interest rate under this might be better than the interest rate under the
Bonding.
plan.
Now, while they're bonding, they can't do it again. Because the bonds terms have gone up, but they're at 2.5%, 2.6%.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we've said the T-bill rate here, and I thought I had a conversation with staff or UW that under the current structure, it would be over 4%.
Mr. Chairman, the current language is the University of Wyoming is allowed to take a loan out from the LISRA, and it is a variable rate based upon the prior year's return of the LSRA. So they're skittish about having a good year and all of a sudden they have 9 or 10 or better percent. It would be great for the state.
So it's, I see, so it's. And is it all the lizard or is it just part of the lizard? Because we've got a third of the lizard that's being invested in a more aggressive fashion.
The language on the interest rate does not distinguish between the tranches of the LISRA. So it's the
So
blended total rate.
It would make more sense to,
Mr. Chairman, what we've drafted here, I think it's fixed at the time of origination of the
Yeah.
loan. We didn't provide, that's what I'm saying. I think this might be more favorable than the
Well,
current structure. The current structure, he says, is variable
so
interest.
under the, I see what you're saying. They could still use this current as amended for a certain amount of dollars. But
Correct.
So, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I see. You might want the dollar limit,
I don't know that anybody's answered Representative Swanser's question yet. But I guess the way I would interpret that is really that becomes a function of SLIB. So if somebody wants to come and do a 15-year, 15-year note or a 30-year note or whatever that is. The way it's currently structured, that's up to the discretion of the SLIB board to make that decision, as I understand it.
Mr. Chairman, also a clarification, and Brian can correct me, but on page 12, the modifications you're making to the student dormitory capital construction loans is not available to the university. These are for community college districts only.
So the university, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, so the university loan is in a whole different section of statute? Okay, I guess we can have that discussion tomorrow then, but it'd be nice to know the outlines of the parameters of the existing loan option for the university.
okay.
We can get that, and it may actually be referenced in the LSRA legislation that the Select Committee on Capital Finance. It is not, it was removed from that.
Okay. Okay, any other?
Mr. Chairman, is that 262, Brian? Well, so we're going to want to know whether that removal disadvantaged the university. The people removing it wanted to help them, but it might have disadvantaged them. I don't know what the
Well,
relative
Depends
rates
on
are.
what action we take.
Mr. Chairman, I'll move the bill.
Been moved.
It's been moved and seconded. Now, any further amendments? Any further amendments? Plus other than the corrections, the typos. I think those are typos, so we don't have to do that. Okay. Question on the bill. Any public comment? We'll do that one more time. Public comment on the bill. Close public comment. I think we're ready for roll call.
Mr. Chairman, the motion is on 23 LSO 0100 version 0.10. Representative Kinner.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Schwartz. Representative Simpson.
Excused.
Representative Stiff.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Senator Guru.
Aye.
Senator Hicks.
Aye.
Senator Salazar. Senator Steinmetz. Co-Chairman Kinski.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, motion has been adopted. House bill or Senate file?
I'm inclined to send this to the Senate first. You guys are a little bit more experienced. We've got couple of weeks of educating of our 27 new members. So I think if it comes over as passed by the Senate, this thing will have a better chance of flowing.
I thought there were 62 members.
62, well, 27 new.
We're happy to take it on, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, let's do that. Senate fund.
So, Mr. Chairman. So we're done with that bit of business. Did I understand the storm is moving at 11 tonight?
Tonight, right? So Don, what you can just let everyone know what you, just have that conversation we had. Thanks, Brian, we're done. Yeah, any other business for the day?
Mr. Chairman, I don't mind a few comments while we're still
Okay.
in session. LSO staff and the session staff did advise all of the agencies and send them a Zoom link in the event that their travel is impaired, given the storm that is moving in. We do have some folks scheduled from the Gaming Commission who would normally come down from Casper. I don't know if they have elected to leave already or not, as well as I think the University of Wyoming indicated interest in participating or being available to answer questions on capital construction. So all members of all scheduled participants have been sent the Zoom link in the event that inclement weather impairs their ability to attend in person. Tomorrow's agenda includes the morning session, which is focused on state construction. You have almost the entire morning, other than a break, dedicated to that bill. In the afternoon, you have 4 agencies, ETS, and you'll recall that there is a draft legislation which would expand ETS's services in cybersecurity and GIS. That was a holdover from the October meeting. Then there is the Wyoming Gaming Commission supplemental budget, Department of Corrections supplemental budget, and 15-minute presentation by the Fire Prevention and Electrical Safety. This is not on their budget, but rather related to an issue regarding the increase of their fees. And that would conclude the day's activities.
Okay. Yeah, let's, with that, we'll stand adjourned until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning.